Thank you so much for tuning into our program featuring two of our favorite MSNBC journalists, Jacob Soboroff and Katy Tur. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Bloc, and this is the first event of our 25th season. It's been 2 years since Jacob's story on family separation at the border and children in cages shell-shocked America. His reporting on this subject was relentless, from the border in Texas to Washington, D.C. Jacob's book, Separation: An American Tragedy, warns us that we need to remember this moment in our history when our own government tore children from their parents and scattered them without any plan for reunification. It's a book that you must read. I couldn't put it down. Jacob shares his disbelief, his outrage, and his sense of duty on every page. It's great reporting as we go through not only Jacob's personal horror, but the experiences of several families juxtaposed to the administration's antics, denial, and brutal behavior that somehow still managed to shock us. This isn't supposed to happen in America. Jacob's coverage clearly changed policy and helped to reunite countless families. Katy Tur holds down the fort at MSNBC at 2 p.m. daily. Her terrific book, Unbelievable, my front row seat to the craziest campaign in American history, documented her tour of duty on the campaign trail and what happened to her as she fact-checked and consistently reported the candidates' lies. Katy and Jacob will chat about separation, and I urge you to buy a copy now. Chevalier's has many signed copies of Jacob's book, and you can find the link to Chevalier's at writersblockpresents.com. I'm so delighted to welcome Katy Tur and Jacob Soboroff, and I only wish this were in person.
Thanks, Andrea.
I certainly do too.
Me too. Thank you for everything. Hi, Katy.
Hi, Jacob. I feel as the moderator here, I get to introduce you. Jacob Soboroff, writer of the book Separated, my good friend from growing up in Los Angeles, my partner on the swamp, a man who does not know how to eat avocado toast, appropriate joke. Listen, your book is really impressive. And I say that as somebody who used to compete with you to be a reporter when we were 18 years old. You wrote one hell of a book, and it is really difficult to put down. It also is really difficult to read at times. I almost wish that I was reading it having not had a child. I think that might have made it easier at times, because any parent who reads this will feel it acutely. And I'm getting teared up even thinking about some of the passages. I want to start with where we are today, because I feel like that's going to give us context for the rest of the book. Where do we stand with separated children? How many kids are still not reunited with their parents?
I'll answer that question in a second, Katy, but I just want to say thanks again to Andrea. Thanks again to Writer's Block. I remember going to your Writer's Block event with Pat Morrison when your book came out, and I thought, I have no idea how Katy Tur wrote a book. I don't know how to write a book. I don't know if I ever wrote a book, what would this book be about? The first thing I should just say to everybody, all 470 people here, which is really remarkable, and kudos to Writer's Block for being able to get everybody to come out digitally like this. I didn't know how to write a book, so I called you. And by the way, to everybody watching, this is me and Katy do this all the time, just not with 470 people watching. We are best of friends. We grew up together here in LA. What she said is true. We competed against each other to become a reporter, and Katy won. I was doing like red carpets for the AMC channel and filming myself and putting it on YouTube and doing things for LAobserve.com. Shout out to Kevin Roderick. But you've always been a mentor to me. And do you remember what you said when I asked you when I first decided to write this book?
Just right.
Just right. And you also told me a computer program to use, which was, I don't remember, what was it called?
Scrivener.
So it became useful. It was on this computer. The other thing, I will get into the substance of this, and that's why most people are here, and I'm grateful for that. But the other thing I want to say is I wrote most of the book in my laundry room, which is right over there. I'm in my kitchen right now, but I couldn't get the Wi-Fi to work in the laundry room. So at the last second, I ran into the kitchen. So welcome to my kitchen. The answer to your question is we don't know. What we know is that 5,400 approximately children were taken systematically by the Trump administration in what can only be described as an unprecedented abuse of the human rights of children. And that's not me saying that, that's the American Academy of Pediatrics. And Physicians for Human Rights takes it a step further and calls it torture. They say what the Trump administration did meets the clinical definition of torture of these children. And they did it on purpose. Around zero tolerance in that time that we were all paying very close attention, around 2,800 kids were taken. It was later found out in an investigation done by the Inspector General of Health and Human Services that there were thousands more who were accounted for. Since the policy ended, another 1,000 children, according to the ACLU at least, have been taken from their parents. And the truth is that while most of the children in that initial batch of 2,800 have been either reunited with their parents or placed with a sponsor in the United States, because remember, 400 plus parents were deported without their children before they were able to have the ability to reunite. We don't know, the ACLU cannot even find all of the parents of the children who were taken and tried to link them up. And so the answer is, we don't know how many parents and children are ultimately still left to be reunited. And because of shoddy record keeping, we may never know. And I write all about that in the book.
You also choose to tell the story about two migrants, a father and a son, Juan and Jose, not their real names, but the names that they chose to give you to protect some semblance of their identity, and how they were separated at the border. Just give me a little bit of their story and where they are today.
Yeah. The first thing I want to say about them is that they're just extraordinary people, just like every single one of the 5,400 families that went through this together. And that every one of them has their own story, right? And every one of them went through a very similar experience, but each and every one of them are extremely different people. And Juan and Jose, as you said, those are the names that they chose to protect themselves and their family that they left behind in Guatemala. They came from a place called Detain, which you might have read about in the Washington Post just a couple of days ago. It is in Detain, Guatemala, exactly. It is a critical corridor for narco trafficking. Virtually all of the cocaine and other drugs that come to the United States pass through this region of Guatemala. One way to know that, by the way, and I write about this in the book, is that we were once together and he said to me, if you want to know what's going on in Detain, he slid his phone across the table to me and wrote Narcos Aterrizando en Detain. And when you look at it, what you see is thousands or hundreds at the very least of airstrips that are built in the middle of the rainforest that are used as trafficking areas for cartels to bring drugs into the United States and ultimately into the bodies of American consumers. So long story short about Juan and Jose, this was a father and son, just like me and my son. And when I saw the picture of Jose, when Juan showed it to me for the first time, he looked just like me, I thought, when I was a 12-year-old hanging out in his dad's store. I would hang in my dad's office. His hair was slicked back. He was wearing, cool sunglasses for a 12-year-old and an oversized t-shirt. And his father, twice before, had come to the United States as an economic migrant to come and make money for his family, and he would return each time. And ultimately, they got tangled up with narcos in their community, that after Juan sold a vehicle to someone, that vehicle ended up in the hands of the narcos. They wanted Juan to sign over the paperwork for the car. He wasn't able to do it because he no longer had the car. And they threatened his life and his son's life. And so they decided to pick up and leave, come to the United States, where they thought it represented safety and security, and one day their family could join them. And the minute they set foot into the United States, attempting to turn themselves into the Border Patrol to seek asylum, they were picked up, brought to the Yuma Border Patrol station, and separated and put into different cells. They didn't see each other again for nearly 5 months.
And they're together again now?
They're back together again now. You've spoiled the story now, Kate. No, but they're back together again. Thank God. And they're together in the Washington, D.C. area, where Jose is going to school and doing vocational classes and working, learning to become an electrician, and his father, Juan, is working in construction. And honestly, I really do have come to love them as friends. I've seen them when you and I were shooting American Swamp, sometimes I would go and see them and have dinner with them in the DC area, and I've done it several times since. And the reason I should say that the reason that they wanted to participate in the book is because, for the same reason I did, they went through this, but they had so many questions about what happened and how. They wanted it to never happen again. And those are the exact same reasons that I decided to write the book.
So I've had conversations with people who work at DHS and the Border Patrol, both in this administration and the last administration, and their empathy for those crossing the border is limited. And it's not necessarily just a Trump administration thing. There is a feeling among those who work at the border or who work around the border that a lot of the migrants that come over and declare asylum aren't telling the truth. In your experience, and from the migrants that you've spoken to, tell us what you can say about that.
It's just not true. And the facts don't support that allegation. What they're talking about is something specifically called fraudulent family units. Basically, people come faking that they're a family, that say, like, for instance, if Juan had said, Jose's my son, but he wasn't my son, it happens in a tiny fraction of the cases. They don't track it, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they don't track the overall percentage. But when you drill down and talk to people who actually know this, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. And I do think certainly that there are people that take advantage of the asylum laws and perhaps come with children or figure out some other way to get into the country. But it is you don't take one of the most dangerous journeys, perhaps the most dangerous journey in the world, through some of the most dangerous places in the world, in order to come here and flip a coin and fake the fact that you are coming for a better life. All you have to do is go talk to people along the border, and it's instantly recognizable, the authenticity and the veracity of the stories. And the idea that it's not true, the idea that people are faking it, it's just another talking point. It's one of many talking points that are easily disprovable, like people coming across the border in large measure are MS-13. You know, we all of these, you heard them from the president before I ever heard them, when you were covering them on the campaign. And a lot of that stuff just isn't true.
Do you have a copy of the book in front of you?
Yeah, I do. Hold on.
By the way, this is the book for everyone who is out there who hasn't seen the cover.
Here it is.
I want you to do a reading, because I think it's so interesting when I hear the words out of the writer's mouth, and this is your experience. If you could go to page 207, I want you to read page 207, 208, 209, starting at "We were warned not to speak with the children," and going until "and Scott Lloyd wanted gone was created" on page 209. Okay,
so this is, just to give some context, this is the chapter where I first went into a place called Casa Padre, which was a former Walmart, 250,000 square foot former Walmart that was converted into nominally a shelter for migrant children. And what happened was, I don't know if you remember this, but Jeff Merkley, the senator, had attempted to get into this facility, had live streamed it on Facebook, and was turned away around the time that separations were coming in sort of to the national consciousness. And the truth of the matter is, I should say, I didn't really see the separations coming. I had spent a lot of time covering the border, but really, like, is the wall needed or not? What's the reality of deportations? Those kinds of things. And so when I was working on a Dateline hour-long documentary about reality of life along the border, and I was invited into the shelter to tour it by a woman named Katie Waldman, who is now named Katie Miller. She married Stephen Miller ultimately, but she was the main spokesperson for the department.
I've got a question on her a little bit later, but keep going.
Okay, we'll talk about that later, of Homeland Security. And what she said to me is they were going to invite me into this place because they wanted journalists to characterize what was going on inside before Democrats on what's called a CODEL, a congressional delegation, were able to go in. So Waldman arranged for me to fly down there to Brownsville and to get into this shelter. And so I did. And when I got there, I had no idea what to expect. So once I was inside, this is the part that you asked me to read. And we were in a lobby, which was basically, to me, it looked like a spa. It was like, you know, you walk in and it's like tile floors, someone behind the desk, etc. And so here we go. We were warned not to speak with any of the children. And with that, the door opened into the cavernous facility. All I could see were young boys everywhere I looked. I jotted down what I saw and what I was thinking in my spiral notebook while my head was on a swivel. I didn't look down at the notebook as I wrote, and my handwriting suffered for it. It's true. If the boys weren't sitting in chairs along walls waiting together in a room or sitting at cafeteria-style tables, they were in line to eat. In their hands were trays holding Oreo cookies, applesauce, Jell-O, chicken, and mashed potatoes. I was walking side by side with Alexia Rodriguez, the lawyer for the facility. When I expressed amazement at what I was seeing, without skipping a beat, she told me and another reporter standing near to her to smile at the kids because, quote, they feel like animals in a cage being looked at. I think she realized how truthful she had just been because she immediately said she didn't want that comment to be on the record, which of course is not how that works. In fairness to Rodriguez, cages was perhaps the wrong word. There were none here I could see, which I found important to note after Senator Merkley used the phrase about a Border Patrol facility in McAllen, Texas, not far from here, which led to confusion online. Rodriguez was right, though. The kids were looking at us with a deer in the headlights gaze. A group of 10 reporters with notepads chronicling any detail we could vacuum up as we were herded like animals through the facility. As we continued walking, she explained that all of the approximately 1,500 kids would eat in a 2-hour window, rotating. Disobeying orders, I couldn't help saying hello, asking the children how they were doing the best I could with my limited Spanish. I soon was asked to stop. As we were shepherded to an area where boys lined up to take a shower and into the rooms where they slept, I noticed the first of many quotes on the wall there. Observe good faith and justice towards all nations. With craned heads, we looked inside one of the 313 bedrooms. 5 twin beds were arranged like puzzle pieces to fit into the small room. We were told 5 beds per room was unusual. Olga Garcia, the executive program director, told me these extra cots were part of a variance the facility had received starting in May, around the time zero tolerance was announced by Attorney General Sessions. At this point, I looked over at Brian Marriott, the stocky former Trump campaign aide, and now Senior Director of Communications and Media Relations for the Administration for Children and Families, and asked him if he had ever been to Casa Padre before. He hadn't, he admitted. Pretty nice, he quipped. Not what I was thinking. As we continued walking, we again passed by the cafeteria where we started. For the first time, I noticed there was a mural of President Trump that stretched the length of the entire wall. Incredulous, I read the quote that accompanied the mural. Sometimes, losing a battle, you find a new way to win the war. I walked away. We wound our way through narrow hallways. Along one wall, I saw a phone, which signage made clear was for the young boys detained here to use if they wanted to raise a complaint outside of the building. Next to the phone was a piece of paper with names of local service organizations children could call for help. The Cameron County Child Advocacy Center, a child abuse prevention advocacy organization, the Valley Baptist Medical Center, a hospital, and Probar Children's Project, a legal services agency for children and adults in immigration detention. Almost as fast as I could register what kind of horrors might compel a child to pick up that phone to call one of those service providers, we came upon another room, a barbershop where kids were getting a trim. Where am I? What is this? The thoughts that ran through my head were dizzying, but I tried to stay focused. I couldn't shake the phone booth, and I went back to see it a second time. At one point, I asked a staffer how separated families would ultimately reunite. After families are apprehended at the border and children are taken from parents, I was told the Department of Homeland Security sends intake emails noting the child is going to be transferred. The Office of Refugee Resettlement, when receiving a child, completes the intake process within 24 hours after first immediately providing a shower and food. But let me keep going just to this next paragraph because it's important. It was during the intake process I learned that case managers would generally find out about separations, and they would then notify other relevant agencies that they were caring for a separated child. this is also how the list that Jim De La Cruz was keeping and Scott Lloyd wanted gone was created.
So that's important, that last paragraph. And first off, just that description is haunting. And it only got worse from the other facilities that were toured. And as we learned that it wasn't older kids that were being separated, but what they called, this euphemism, tender age,
exactly,
were babies. I mean, I remember reading a headline when I was on maternity leave right after I had my son, and all I could read was the headline because I burst out crying, and I still haven't read the article. And it's almost been a year of a father who had his 4-month-old ripped from his hands and was told that they'd be reunited on the plane as long as he just got on the plane. And he got on the plane and they never brought his baby. But tell me why this paragraph, which ends with Scott Lloyd wanted gone, the list that Scott Lloyd wanted gone. Who is Scott Lloyd and what list did he want gone?
Scott Lloyd was the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is the agency within, I mentioned Administration for Children and Families. It goes Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Office of Refugee Resettlement. And the Office of Refugee Resettlement is the custodian of all of the unaccompanied migrant children in the custody of the federal government. So he was the caretaker. He was the legal guardian of the 10,000 plus kids, many of which came on their own, but hundreds, thousands of which were separated from their families. He was their guardian. And what I just read to you happened on June 13th, 2018. I was on the air with you the next day, I remember. And in April 20th, if I'm not mistaken, an article came out in the New York Times by Caitlin Dickerson, an extraordinary reporter and absolute bombshell expose that said 700 children. We didn't know the number, but we knew separations were happening. 700 children had been taken from their parents by the Trump administration. And when that article was released, it was based on a list that had leaked from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, an informal list tracking the separations of children and parents, because this was something that we were told, and even ORR was told, wasn't happening. And top officials within ORR, career officials, not Scott Lloyd, he was a Trump-appointed official, kept asking questions. We're seeing numbers tick up. We're hearing anecdotal reports from case managers like the ones I described, that these kids are ending up unaccompanied, basically rendered unaccompanied, as Chris Hayes said to me, during the height of this. And when this happened, Scott Lloyd was beside himself. He was angry. He was embarrassed that this list had leaked to the media, and his first thought was to get rid of the list, not to figure out what was happening, if separations were truly happening, and how to protect the children, as he had been warned he must do by people like Commander Jonathan White within the agency. The instinct was to get rid of the list. And so in a meeting, and the list was kept by the gentleman, Jim De La Cruz, another career official who I mentioned. In this meeting at ORR, Scott Lloyd queried his employees about, why are we keeping the list? What can we do with the list? He was saying he was angry that the list had leaked. And essentially the direction made its way down to the career employees that Scott Lloyd, and this is their interpretation of the events, wanted the list gone. And two career staffers, Jalen Sualong and Jim De La Cruz, refused to destroy the list. And had they followed through with that initial desire that Scott Lloyd had, the critical linkage, the only linkage between parents and children would have been gone. This informal list that was being kept only because people were opposed to the policy inside the department. And those 700 children, we don't know if they ever would have been reunited.
So you're saying that list was the only document that had the information that linked the child to their parent.
It's almost unbelievable to think about. And there's one thing that I said at the time during the reporting, I'm sure I said this to you on the air, that I said over and over again, there was no plan to reunite these children, ultimately, once they were taken from each other. And in some measure, I was wrong about that. And the way I was wrong is that there were plans to reunite the children. Time and again, people inside ICE, a woman by the name of Claire Trickler McNulty, who speaks to me on the record in the book, said that they had warned superiors they would not be able to link parents and children if they followed through with family separations. Commander White warned people like Kevin McAleenan, at the time the CBP, the head of CBP, and later became the head of DHS when Kirstjen Nielsen was fired by President Trump, that they were not going to be able to do this. If they paused, they could fix the system and make sure to take care of the children. But they didn't do it. Kirstjen Nielsen signed the policy into existence despite denying that it happened. They didn't wait. They didn't wait to have a way to put the children back together. It wasn't that there wasn't one. It's that they didn't wait for one to be put into place.
Adam Sir of The Atlantic wrote a piece a couple years ago, and the headline of the piece,
"The cruelty is the point."
Yeah, it was invoked by Mary Trump in her book.
Yeah.
That's out as well. The cruelty is the point. Do you think the cruelty was the point here in this policy?
I don't think, I know. And John Kelly said it in March of 2017 on CNN. This is a policy to deter people from coming to the United States. What is deterrence? Deterrence is scaring people from coming to the United States. Katie Waldman, now Katie Miller, said the same thing to me, that they had hoped that the family separation policy would be so hard for people to see, members of Congress, for member of Congress to see, that they would have to change the laws to stop two things. One, what's called TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, and the ability to immediately and the ability to hold families indefinitely together in family detention. They called those quote unquote loopholes that allowed migrant families to come into the country and be able to be released into the interior, what's described as catch and release. They all along wanted to end catch and release. Stephen Miller said it during the campaign. I saw him with my own eyes say it in 2016 in a ballroom in Colorado. Go ahead.
Tell me about your first experience encountering Stephen Miller, because what I liked about this book was that there were moments that reminded me of 2016 in a way that I mean, you saw it from a different perspective than I did. I was in the middle of it every single day, and you parachuted in. So while Stephen Miller had become a character that I knew well, he was somebody that was completely foreign to you. So when you encountered him, I believe it was in Colorado.
I think I said, I read in the book, the quote is, "Who the fuck is this dude?" When I saw him talking and literally screaming about undocumented immigrants in this ballroom in Colorado. And again, I was wrong. And I'm never, in this book, I am not afraid to say that I was wrong at multiple occasions. I was on the Rachel Maddow show that night. I just thought to myself, these guys have no chance. Look at the way that this guy's talking about other human beings. They're so disorganized that Ted Cruz absolutely clobbered them at that Colorado event and won all the delegates at that event. And I just heard Stephen Miller screaming about the tragic killing of Kate Steinle, who was killed by an undocumented immigrant in San Francisco. They used her life in this example to push for restrictive immigration policies. And so when I heard Stephen Miller say that, and then later heard at the convention that we were both at where was the Republican convention? In Cleveland, where Donald Trump was screaming about undocumented immigration and ending catch and release, I just said, then what is this? I don't even know like what they're talking about, how they're going to execute this. But they were warning all along that they were going to do something like this. And that it was imminent. And I guess I just didn't see it coming. I missed it then. I missed it in the run up to separations as a reporter. And I actually feel, deeply guilty about that, because it was something that many other reporters like Caitlin Dickerson or Lomi Creel from the Houston Chronicle, or our colleague Julia Ainsley when she was at Reuters, when she initially broke the story, they were considering this, they all saw it. And I didn't see it. And it was sort of right there in front of my face and your face and all of our faces all along. You're muted. How do we unmute Katie? Go to the bottom left, Katie, and see where it says mute with the microphone.
Andrea had to unmute me. Thank you, Andrea. I tried to mute myself to cough, and I locked myself out. There's another.
Well, let me ask you a question, Katie. Yeah, did you have any idea the types of policies? You were with Donald Trump virtually every day. You heard him say this kind of stuff all the time. You probably knew Stephen Miller on a personal level. I only saw him face to face at one time. Was this something that you expected? Something frankly as grotesque as a policy to torture children and take them away from their parents?
I didn't think Congress would let him. I didn't think the Republican Party would fall in line the way that it did. I mean, he was very clear about what he wanted to do. He wanted to build the wall. He wanted to get rid of all illegal immigrants in this country, undocumented immigrants. He wanted a deportation force.
Yeah.
He wanted to kill the family members of terrorists. I mean, there was no position that he took that wasn't too extreme. He wanted to punish women who had abortions. I just thought that the limits on what he would be able to do would be upheld by not just Democrats in Congress, but by Republicans. I think what's been surprising is the way that they have fallen in line. But what Trump has tried to do shouldn't be surprising. Sorry, I dropped my pen. Shouldn't be surprising to anybody. He was very clear, and he made no. He didn't hide anything he wanted to do when he was on the campaign trail. But
you make go ahead. Yeah, well, I just want to say you make a really good point, which is, and it's part of the reason that I call the book Separated, not just because of the physical separation that people like Juan and Jose had to endure, but also because we all have had a mental separation about how we got to this point. Yeah. The fact that over 30 years, under Democratic and Republican administrations, starting with the Clinton administration, we've had aggressive deterrence policies that have forced migrants to come into this country using dangerous and deadly routes, oftentimes dying in the process. And the fact that Trump did this, I now know, and I now understand, but certainly didn't at the time, was only possible because of previous administrations. Barack Obama never had a family separation policy, but he did deport more people than any other president in history. And we should remember that, because in whether or not there is a next administration come November, this is just the way that it is. This is America. Family separation is America. And it's a natural outgrowth, although extreme one, of the system that we have.
You don't absolve the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or the Obama administration. It's part of the reason why we need comprehensive immigration reform to address a lot of these issues, because the structures, as you said, were in place to allow the Trump administration to exploit them, take them to their cruelest ends. But you talk about separated, the way we're separated from how we got here. Well, how about the way we're separated from what's actually happening in some cases underneath us? You talk about crossing over the United States-Mexico border in Tijuana. And underneath you is a woman who is a Congolese mother. And this, I was reading this at night. Tony was asleep and I started crying like a baby, because I realized that I'm going around living my life, playing with my 1-year-old, grilling on the barbecue, and I might feel like, oh God, this coronavirus is difficult, but it is nothing compared to the horrors that families experience every day, and they're experiencing it to try and give their kids a better life. This is on page 74 and 75. You talk about a Congolese mom and her daughter separated from each other, and the many flights they had to take through many different countries to get to Tijuana and turn themselves in. They're not sneaking across the border, they're turning themselves in and asking.
So they wanted to declare asylum at the port of entry, not even in between the port of entry.
And that's part of what people don't understand. They think that people are running across the border and hiding. I mean, they're running across the border and they're searching out.
Looking for a border patrol agent or a CBP agent, like you see at customs when you come back from the airport, and say, I'm here to declare asylum.
Yes, and so she did, and her daughter was taken away from her, and she's the woman that whose name is on the first lawsuit to end these.
If it wasn't for her, she became known as Miss L. And if it wasn't for her, it gives me the chills actually talking about this. The parents and children who have been reunited successfully thanks to the ACLU and their lawsuit against the Trump administration wouldn't have been. She became the named plaintiff in the case, and it ultimately became a class action suit. But what you're talking about is basically adjacent to a outlet mall between Tijuana and San Diego. There's a prison or jail, whatever you want to call it, under the ground. And in that location is where she was detained and taken away from her daughter, who was sent to Chicago. She didn't know if Chicago was a man's name, where it was, what these people were talking about, but she could hear the wails of her daughter crying and screaming for her mother. I actually obtained a document that I put in the book that not until Kirsten Nielsen was sent an article about her and her case, and the fact that this was becoming a PR crisis, was she freed after a rapid DNA test that the ACLU was able to get her to prove that it actually was her daughter. They were claiming you came here and that's not really your daughter. And with a DNA test, they proved it and she was released. But she ultimately stayed on the case. And because of her case, the ACLU was able to win an injunction to stop the policy and then to ultimately force the government to come up with a plan and reunite all of these kids and their parents, or as many at least as they could.
You talk about some heroes in this book, and she's one of them. Lee Gallant of the
Yep.
ACLU is another. Commander White, De La Cruz. Before we get to some questions that were sent to Andrea that people want to ask you, we got to touch on what has been the controversy of the day, which is some reporting that you did about Katy Miller, and she's pushing back. The administration is pushing back, saying that you didn't hear what you said. First, what did you hear her say?
Well, let me pick it up and read it just so I make sure I get it right.
354.
354. I will reveal who I was with in a second. I was out to dinner, drinks with Katy Miller, the spokesperson, after a long day of working in Washington, D.C. And what Katy Miller had said to me, we were talking about family separations, and the other person I was with had asked her about defending zero tolerance on behalf of the Trump administration. And she said to me something that she said to me previously, again, to me and my colleague who I was sitting with. My family and colleagues told me when I have kids, I'll think about the separations differently, but I don't think so. DHS sent me to the border to see separations myself to try to make me more compassionate, but it didn't work. It didn't work? I will never forget what I saw. Seriously, are you a white nationalist? I asked, exasperated. No, but I believe if you come to America, you should assimilate. Why do we need to have Little Havana? So, Katy Miller, through Kayleigh McEnany, the White House spokesperson today, denied that she said this. And what I wrote in response is that I wasn't the only person to hear Katy Miller say this. I was sitting at the table with another person. You could read it on page 354 of the book. Rachel Maddow read this, that little bit on her show the other night, but she didn't reveal who I was sitting with in the book. Would you like to reveal who I was sitting with at the time?
You were sitting with me. I was there sitting next to you, and I was 5 months pregnant at the time. And I asked because as a 5-month pregnant woman, I thought, I can't imagine ever doing this myself. Do you think, how could you do it? Do you think it'll change if you have kids? And that was her response. And
you were the one who asked her the question. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Did she say what I wrote, or did she not?
Absolutely said she was sent down to the border to make her more compassionate. It didn't work. And she absolutely said that she doesn't.
I asked her if she was a white nationalist.
You asked her if she's a white nationalist, which I remember I kind of, I was surprised that you said that. You were so blunt. And she responded with, there shouldn't be a Little Havana. Yeah, she said all those things. And it's problematic for the Trump administration right now and for the president on his reelection, because Florida is a state that he needs to win. It's a state that their internal polls show he is not winning. The Cuban population is a large percentage of that state. And if he wants to win it, he needs at least some of them.
Look, I've been thinking a lot about this because I don't want to be accused of lying, especially in the White House briefing room. But not only were you there, not only has she said similar versions of this to other people, not only have other sources reached out since Rachel Maddow read this quote on the book to say that she has said similar things to them, but she, let's not forget, was also the lead spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security, denying that a family separation policy was existing when I had seen it with my own eyes. So ultimately, I'm fine with people making up their own minds. But you were there, I was there, and other people have heard similar versions of that from Katy.
He also confirmed that she was sent down there for that very reason.
There's no doubt about it. She posted pictures of it on her Instagram, and they were there for anybody who followed her, myself included, to see. She said it to me on multiple occasions. So, look, the book is not about Katy Miller. The book is about how family separations could possibly happen in America, how the United States government could systematically torture, place under Mylar blankets in cages, supervised by a security contractor in a watchtower, 5,400 children and traumatize them for the rest of their lives. One official told me it is the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of my lifetime. And people like Scott Lloyd specifically, and this is a direct quote, and he responds to it in the book, is the most prolific child abuser in modern American history. You know, and what I wanted to do was answer, how could this possibly have happened? And the answer is uncomfortable. You know, it's not one that's politically easy to digest. And you really have to think about this, and you have to think about our own complicity in allowing this all to happen. And that's what I want people to focus on. But look, it's all there for everybody to read, and they should read it, because the truth is there, and the sourcing notes are in the book also.
I can confirm it as well. I got a question for you from
Sure.
a member of the audience, I think. You say, or the question is, you're reporting about Scott Lloyd, head of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, is chilling. His idea to destroy the list that connected children to their parents sounds like a criminal flushing evidence down the toilet. Were there any efforts to prosecute him?
I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is that, first of all, I should give credit to Dan Diamond of Politico, who first reported in an item in one of his stories that people were talking about this, that this had happened at ORR. And Dan Diamond later asked Scott Lloyd about this on his podcast as I was writing this book, and Scott Lloyd denied it, which is part of the reason I wanted to look into it, because I had heard it quite a bit also. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, under oath, asked Scott Lloyd if he ordered anybody to destroy a list. And he said he never ordered anybody, which may be a Katie Miller style tap dance around, you know, the answer. I don't know if there's, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if that's criminal negligence. I don't know if it's, if he lied under oath technically to Congress when he said it. But based on the interviews I did with multiple sources who were in the room when this was discussed, this was the idea that was put on the table. And once the officials in the room, went outside of the room and talked to the career staffers responsible for the list, they felt very clearly, according to people who know what their thinking was at the time and what they had to say, that was the order that had come down from Scott Lloyd.
This is an interesting one. I'm not sure how you're going to answer it, but I'll give it to you. If Democrats are successful in taking the presidency in November, what's your sense of how fast Biden will move to reverse the most egregious administrative immigration policies without a Dem Senate or with a Dem Senate?
Well, the two big things about what he's going to have to deal with. Number one, is he going to reverse 1325, which is the law that Julian Castro talked about when he was a presidential candidate, saying this is the reason, this is the statute that allows the government to separate children and parents, you know? And so will he get rid of it? Will he attempt to get rid of it and put that through the Congress? Because the truth is the Obama administration wanted to circumvent TVPRA and be able to indefinitely detain families, just like the Trump administration wanted to do. They just didn't use family separations as the wedge in order to make that happen. You can ask anybody who was involved in the administration. Ask Jay Johnson. Jay Johnson spoke to me on the record for the book. You know, they may have had similar policy goals when they were both flooded with a surge of unaccompanied children. They had very different ways about going about, quote unquote, fixing it. So, and the other thing is, just real quick, what are they going to do when tens of thousands of children try to stream into the United States? Right now, because of coronavirus, they're keeping everyone on the other side of the border. How is Biden going to deal with that? Is he going to use these temporary shelters like Tornillo that you and I reported on together on June 14th, 2018? Or are they going to find another way to care for these children where they don't have to be detained? Because that is what set this nation into the state of outrage that we saw.
The law that you're talking about, just specifically, it's the one that makes crossing the border a criminal offense and not just a civil offense, right?
Well, it gives the federal government the ability to charge people for illegal entry into the country. Most of the time, the government didn't do that. They had the discretion to not do it. And the Obama administration, unless it was a case of illegal reentry coming multiple times, or parents or family members who presented a danger to the safety, the well-being of the children, they didn't prosecute, you know. And the Trump administration, that's what zero tolerance was. They decided, we're just going to charge every single person who crosses that border with the crime of entering illegally. And I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but the fact is many of those migrants didn't have a choice but to cross illegally in between ports of entry, because they were doing what was called metering, making people wait in an extremely long line in order to come in legally. So the Trump administration forced this. That's why we kept saying this is a man-made crisis. It doesn't have to be this way.
Yeah, yes. Here's another one. It's important to remember that ICE is only 17 years old. Right now, it seems that the courts are the ones who are
Good
trying
point.
to address the human rights violations in detention camps. Given the current calls to defund and abolish the police to reimagine public safety, what are the steps Congress can take to abolish ICE in order to overhaul our current immigration system?
Well, I think it becomes just like this conversation around defunding the police. What is the degree to which you want to defund or abolish ICE? Do you want to change the rules that govern how ICE works and who ultimately ends up in ICE custody? Or do you want to get rid of the enforcement agency entirely? And some people do, because don't forget, ICE doesn't just detain parents that are apprehended at the border. ICE detains families all the time who are detained in what's called interior enforcement, raids on people's homes, deportations of migrants who are living in this country in the quote unquote interior of the country. So that just becomes a question of policy. How far do you take it? And I don't know. I think that family separations has certainly moved the Democratic Party left on this, but in the Obama administration, you would never hear for somebody calling for that was in the mainstream of the Democratic Party calling for the abolishment of or defunding of ICE.
One other, I spoke with Jacob in June 2019 off the record after visiting the Customs and Border Patrol facility in McAllen, Texas as a Florence compliance attorney. We discussed extensively the horrific conditions faced by children and families in custody. I deeply appreciate Jacob's efforts and for writing this book on a topic so important, but that is sadly so easy for many to forget. My question is, what can everyday Americans do to push for humane treatment of detained children? Is it all about voting?
Pay attention to what's going on and speak up, because guess what, guys? When everybody got into the streets after this family separation policy broke into the headlines, that's when President Trump ended the policy by executive order. And he said it himself. I write about it myself in the book. I talk about behind the scenes of how he ultimately came to be pressured to do so by Ivanka Trump and other people inside the White House. He said, I didn't like the sight or the sounds of families being separated. And the only reason any of us saw that is because of the pressure of activists, of journalists, not just myself, many journalists who were down there, and the people who flooded the streets of the United States to protest this policy. And I really want to say, this is important. Right now, there's around 130 children and parents at risk of separation today. Judge Dolly G in California here has ordered the children released because of an outbreak of coronavirus in ICE family detention. And the Trump administration will not commit to releasing the parents and children together. They're still leaving the separation of these kids from their parents on the table. And they ultimately have to file a plan today. So actually, I should go look at this after we hang up to see what they've said. But as of yesterday, they hadn't taken it off the table. And by the 17th of July, they have to release these children. So if you want them to not be separated, pay attention, speak up right now.
You have new reporting on what's happening in ICE facilities right now. What's going on?
Julia Ainsley, my colleague, and I reported today, and I know she was on the show with you, about an outbreak in the Eloy Detention Center. Almost half of the staff members in the Eloy Detention Center, around 127, I think the number is, of 300, have tested positive for coronavirus. Because of that, declarations from migrants detained inside Eloy, accounts from staff members, current employees that we've spoken with, have told us they're understaffed. Migrants are being left on lockdown inside these facilities instead of treated, humanely, potentially released with the discretion of ICE because of the virus. Many of these people are not detained because they're quote unquote criminals. They're detained because they came here to seek asylum, and the government just keeps them locked up. And so what this reporting indicates is that they weren't ready for coronavirus. There's still an outbreak of coronavirus in many of these facilities. And the employees themselves, one of them said, we're in a war zone. That's the conditions that they're operating in right now inside with this virus. And the people who are at risk are not just the employees, but the migrants who are detained as well.
How hard was it to write this book now that you're a dad? I mean, you're a dad twice over now. You have Noah and you just had a baby girl a couple months ago.
Yeah, they're not here because it'd be too noisy to talk to you during all this. I asked them to leave, but certainly not as hard as what any of these families went through. Not even close. It was painful to revisit the memories. The act of actually finding the notebook I used to take notes that I talked about earlier in the facilities it made my heart pound when I went into the storage unit to pick it up and open it for the first time to recall the sights and sounds of being there. I'm sure I have some measure of whatever, I don't know, some kind of trauma from seeing this myself. It makes me sick, actually, every time I talk about being in McAllen and the processing station. But I'm just a reporter who went in there and saw it and documented it. There were many of us, and there were 5,400 people who were, again, tortured, in the words of Physicians for Human Rights, by the United States government, an act perpetrated by the quote unquote greatest country in the world. And it's them who really went through something.
Jacob, I'm so proud of you for writing this book. You brought a terrible moment back into the spotlight, and revealing that there are still kids suffering. It's important, and it's a must read for anybody who wants to understand the process by which the Trump administration decided to take kids away from their parents. The book is called Separated: Inside an American Tragedy by Jacob Soboroff. I encourage everyone to go out and buy it. I also want to say thank you to Andrea Grossman and Writer's Block in our hometown of Los Angeles. There's nobody better than Andrea. You treat all of your writers like gold.
We should all also apologize to Katie's husband, Tony DeCopel, the co-host of CBS This Morning, who probably should have been sleeping hours ago, but Katie's talking so loud that he's definitely still awake. He has to be in the studio, maybe your home studio.
Voice on.
At what time does he have to wake up tomorrow?
I don't know. I'm asleep.
Good. Andrea, thank you. Katie, thank you.
Thanks to both of you. Everybody, this book is so wonderful. It's such an important work, and I appreciate both of you being here. This is such a complex issue, and you guys touched on the tip of the iceberg. This book has an enormous amount of information that we really need to look at and digest and absorb. And again, November is approaching rapidly. So thank you. Thanks to both of you. See you soon, I hope. And get this book. Chevalier's has it. Go to Writer's Block Presents and you can get a signed copy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Katie.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.